Hello, and welcome to Chapter 1 of Book 2 on The Big Answer, the single biggest answer to life's biggest questions. If you haven't, please start with the video titled Book 1, Intro to the Big Answer, and work through the Book 1 chapters after that before starting on Book 2. In this video, we'll be taking a deeper dive into principles, as we'll be referencing these a lot when talking about the 7 qualities. It's a bit of an abstract concept, but I'll do my best to break it down. If you remember, my initial epiphany was that everything bad was tied to deterioration or destruction. My next question was, what exactly is being deteriorated or destroyed? And that's what led me to the concept of everything being comprised of principles, and that it was these that were deteriorating, or that disappeared when something was destroyed. The 7 qualities were all arrived at by looking at the different ways principles can deteriorate or be destroyed, which is why it's important to understand principles before going on to the 7 qualities themselves in subsequent videos. No, I am not talking about one's personal, subjective principles, such as our personal standards, values, morals, and such. Please be aware that there are already many definitions of principles, and here, we're creating a whole new one that describes objective reality. So push those other ideas aside for now, and let's start with a clean slate. I initially used the word principles as a catch-all or umbrella term for something's features, characteristics, properties, behaviors, etc., so that I didn't need to type all that out every time. And to be honest, for most people applying TPA, this is probably fine, but there are some important differences. Principles are more fundamental. They are what give rise to something's features, characteristics, properties, and behaviors. You could also say that something has features, characteristics, properties, behaviors, etc. In other words, they merely describe it and are more subjective in nature. But something literally is its principles at the deepest, most fundamental level. In other words, they define it and are objective in nature. So that leads us to a definition. Something's fundamental, underlying principles objectively define what it is and can be, as well as what it does and can do. You yourself are a collection of principles that make you, you. You can pause this for a minute to ponder that if you like before moving on. All right, let's explore this concept. It gets esoteric and abstract to start trying to tease apart what would be considered a principle and what would just be considered a feature, characteristic, property, or behavior. As I stated earlier, this is not super important at this level of understanding and application, so don't get too hung up on it. Since principles give rise to features, characteristics, properties, and behaviors, most of the time if you see these deteriorating, that means the underlying principles are also deteriorating. What we do really want to keep in mind is that principles are objective. We can certainly have a concept of something's principles, but principles exist regardless of whether or not something is aware of them, unless they are specifically predicated on one's awareness. For example, if there was nothing conscious in the universe would still mostly operate as it currently does according to the principles of gravity, light, the fusion powering stars, the formation of black holes, the clumping of asteroids and planets, etc. Earth without conscious beings on it would still have waves and tides, mountains and valleys, earthquakes and volcanoes, seasons, etc. Even conscious beings have objective principles that guide their consciousness. You are a product of the wiring of your brain, even if you're not conscious of that wiring. In fact, as anyone who has learned about the brain or has done a decent amount of self-discovery knows, it's actually quite surprising how much of who we think we are is merely a product of our programming and subconscious reactions. As stated in the definition, principles not only define what you are and do, they also define what you can be or can do. You may not know how you'd react in a certain situation, like a helicopter crash in the mountains, or you may not know that, actually, your favorite music would be Bikutsi. You've just never heard it. Further, our understanding of something's principles can be wrong. we may think we're someone we're not. Even the most unreasonable person thinks they're reasonable, right? When trying to understand the external world, we've made mistakes as well. We once thought things were flammable and they contained phlogiston, which was used up as it burned, and the flame went out when there was no phlogiston left. This was totally wrong, of course, but stuff kept burning anyway according to the actual principles of combustion, oblivious to our flawed thinking. In general, our subjective concept of reality will almost always work better the more aligned it is with objective reality. A subjective view that isn't accurate but nevertheless increases the 7 qualities can still be good, just probably not as good as a more accurate world model. The times when a more accurate model of reality doesn't work are always due to us still missing some key piece of information. If someone thinks washing your hands makes the water spirits fight off disease-causing spirits, and you think they're wrong, your model of reality is closer to real reality. But if you then stop washing your hands, this might lead to you becoming sick. This negative outcome doesn't mean it's better to believe in spirits. It means even more information about how reality works is needed. In this case, learning about viruses and bacteria. So understanding principles is very important for not only understanding the rest of the 7 qualities, but also for implementing that understanding in the real world. When we do so, it's important to also understand that principles can come together and form new, emergent principles, so there can be layers of them. For example, one of my principles is that my thigh twitches when you strike just below my knee, the classic knee-jerk reflex. This is an emergent principle that arises from the principles of my muscles, my nerves, and how those nerves are wired in my spine. And their principles emerge from the principles of the atoms and molecules that make them up, and so on down to the most fundamental principles of matter and energy. So principles define what an atom is, what it does, and how a collection of them can make a molecule, or conduct waves, or make a magnet, etc. When you crave ice cream, or cry during a movie, or sneeze, or digest food, that's your huge, complex, interconnected collection of principles working together that make you who and what you are, and make you different from someone else. Customs, language, music, etc. all have their own principles, and collectively make up the principles of your culture. Your relationships with your friends, family, and partner all have their own principles as well. It's a very broadly applicable concept. How do we recognize a principle is present? The 7 qualities themselves point to principles being present. Many people instantly think of order being a hallmark of principles, but that order could be the result of random chance. If, however, that order is also creating something complex, if it's stable, if it arises consistently and repeatedly as the result of a particular dynamic interplay, etc., then that makes it more and more likely that a principle is behind it. So principles show themselves through the observable resulting increase in the 7 qualities. Some people counter that literally everything must be principles, and therefore it's a pointless concept. Not quite. A rock tumbling down a hill will follow all the principles of gravity and friction and conservation of energy, etc., etc., which means that where it ends up at the bottom of the hill is entirely and totally consistent with principles, right? Well, yes, but there's no overarching reason it ended up where it did beyond its starting point and the terrain. Conversely, grains of sand in the desert being blown by the wind will spontaneously form ripples. Atoms will spontaneously form crystals, etc., because these do have principles that guide the process. An example that might drive this point home is if you imagine a pachinko machine that you drop numbered balls into. They would follow all their principles as they knocked and bounced their way down, but you wouldn't expect them to reach the bottom in order of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. If they did, it would be completely random, not because they were following a principle that made them land in that order. When there's a principle, there's a reason for why things happened the way they did, and often there isn't. Moving on, the big answer answers the question of where value judgments come from. I'd like to point out that while every principle has its own associated order, stability, distinctiveness, etc. Principles themselves are judged as being good or bad based on whether or not they lead to an overall broader increase or decrease of the 7 qualities. For example, arsenic has principles that, if ingested by an organism, will cause rapid deterioration and eventual destruction, death of that organism. So arsenic's principles are bad for you. A person having the principle of being a compulsive liar, or a government having the principle of siphoning money from the country into the pockets of oligarchs are more examples of principles being bad because they lead to an overall decrease in the 7 qualities. Can principles change? Yes, absolutely. When we see a change in something, that could be because different principles are being brought out, such as a mean person turning to mush around puppies, or something could be changing in accordance with its principles, like a baby growing, or the principles could actually have changed, like a stroke or major life event changing someone's personality. Principles changing doesn't necessarily signal deterioration. It's only if the new principles aren't followed as closely, decreased order, or there are fewer principles overall, decreased complexity, or the new principles undermine stability, or otherwise undermine the 7 qualities in general, that it would be bad. If the principles changed in ways that increased all these, then that would be good. If there's no change in the 7 qualities, it's simply neutral. Of course, if you subjectively understood the old principles but not the new ones, you might subjectively see the change as bad. This could be social progress, or it could be a new version of your favorite video game that changes a bunch of things, or your romantic partner could do a bunch of self-improvement that baffles you and you prefer the old version of them. TBA is objective, so your subjective view would be objectively wrong, though this may not be entirely comforting to you. Going in a bit of a different direction now, I'd like to dispel the notion that principles are somehow the same as rules or laws. They're not. Principles are objective and inherent, not externally imposed. If you made a law that it couldn't rain on a weekend, or that birds couldn't poop on cars anymore, nothing would change in reality. No principles will have changed. And there's no deterioration when it continues to rain on weekends, and birds continue to poop on cars. Similarly, many countries have old laws that people no longer even know about or follow. In England, it's still the law that cab drivers need to ask their passengers if they have the plague or smallpox. No one does this, it's not enforced, so there's no principle and no deterioration when it isn't followed. Just because it's written down on a piece of paper somewhere doesn't make it a principle. Conversely, there are many unspoken and unwritten rules that we simply pick up on as we grow up. It may be that no one is even consciously aware of some of these, yet they would count as principles. Another important difference between rules and principles is that the more principles there are, the more complex something is, whereas rules can go either way. They can foster complexity or limit it. If there were no rules of language or driving, we couldn't communicate complex ideas or have a sophisticated, efficient network of roads. But if someone had different colored hair every week and wore zany clothing, and someone made new rules that you could only have your natural hair color and wear a company-provided uniform, then that would decrease complexity. In this case, adding rules decreased the number of principles. So understanding principles is very important for not only understanding the rest of the 7 qualities, but also for implementing that understanding in the real world. That pretty much hits the main points I could think of. Please provide any feedback on this or any other video. As mentioned, it's a bit of an abstract concept, so if there's a part you're struggling with or you found confusing, please let me know. For now, let's move on. We'll be looking at each of the 7 qualities in more details, starting with order in the next video. I'll see you there, and in the meantime, do get smart.